And more recently, I mean, there's too many to name, but, you know, people like Sarah Ahmed and Ronaldo Walcott and Eve Tuck and Kei-Wen Yang, you know, these are people who are all continuing to point out the ways in which we now have an entire generation, actually multiple generations of scholars of color who have firsthand experience of being included, right? Like through the structures of diversification of the profession, of the academy, of fields, which is not to say that these fields are diverse, right? Like they're still overwhelmingly white, which is part of the problem with the framework. But, you know, fundamental to that criticism is that, and not just criticism, I think complaint, right? Like using Sarah Ahmed's term. Part of the complaint is that inclusivity is fundamentally an invitation for a more diverse range of people to be included within the reward systems of colonialism and white supremacy. And not only have they not included all that many people, right, into that reward system, but it turns out that overwhelmingly for people of color, Black people, Indigenous people, as well as other marginalized, you know, knowledge communities, the rewards of white supremacy don't feel like rewards. You know, they feel like punishments. And so, I mean, punishments or like, you know, extracted labor or, you know, a host of things that just don't feel like a gift that, you know, is wrapped up in a bow and deposited on your doorstep. So I think that when we talk about structural change, you know, we are talking, and I'm just kind of echoing something that, you know, that Ronjaunee was already talking about, but we're talking about really reassessing the reward systems of our profession, of our institutions, and of our fields. And that means going back to how, like, the value systems, you know, what are the values that are not just upheld, you know, in the fields, but that are reproduced? How are things valued? How are people valued, right? How is work valued? And who is that value for, right? Because overwhelmingly, I think that the value still tends, you know, the university is still a colonial institution. And so the value tends to like be shuttled away from people and away from communities, you know, to institutions. And when we talk about, you know, decolonizing the academy, again, with kind of scare quotes around it, because I'm not sure that the academy can survive decolonization. It is a thoroughly colonial institution, but I think that it can serve a purpose, right, in that process. When we talk about structural change, we're talking about rerouting and redistributing the value of the kind of work that we do and that we're all capable of doing. And you know, that's going to require changes in leadership. It's going to require, I had this whole soapbox thing planned that I won't go into unless somebody's interested and asks me to go on at more length, but about how we need more editors of color. We need BIPOC editors. We need BIPOC, you know, like, I don't know, granting agencies. We need people to not just be included and invited to, you know, be at the table and share our voice under these punishing conditions. We need to decide that we are willing to put those voices in charge and, you know, and see what happens and live with the consequences of things changing under new kinds of leadership.
Yeah, and I just kind of wanted to, you know, kind of further say that the reward system you point out is also modeled on like artificial scarcity, right? There are no jobs. What does it mean to be included, right? In a kind of diminishing professoriate of sustainable employment as we speak. So, I mean, you know, as long as faculty in the university don't see themselves as workers and that we don't have you know, there's not going to be a kind of movement towards restructuring because it's only going to be a form of inclusion into the very, very few.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm reminded of somebody mentioning to me because of a sort of fairly big Twitter presence that I was among the most visible romanticists of working right now, and I laughed because I was like, what the. Whoever like wanted to be the most visible romanticist. I mean, it's such an absurd category. The romanticist, right? It's also it's not even. There's neither capital nor cultural capital in being right, in being visible in a field that is diminishing all the time in its sort of relevance and importance. But because I care about romanticism as an ism, as a structuring belief, as a set of commitments to radical possibilities, I don't want to see it disappear. And so that's the other thing. I mean, this came up in a bigger six conversation that Gina was part of, where she was pointing out, like, on the one hand, burn it down. On the other hand, there's like real fear about what happens. Should we sort of thoroughly decolonize, which is to say, as Gina's putting, erase the academy, right? At a moment when the threat of a non-metaphorical fascism and a thoroughly dystopian future is like looming, right? So it's now thoroughly possible for me to imagine a world in America, at least, without humanities education. Mm-hmm. And that should sort of strike a certain amount of fear in us as we talk about the future of our disciplines, right? They're just the simple. I've said this at a Nasser plenary session. I guess it was a year ago. In 30, 40 years, there's not going to be a Nasser, right? Who's going to attend? The contingently employed generalists who, right? I mean, we're staring at dying fields. And so I think one thing that has inspired me about both your and Gina's work in particular is that it always seems motivated, to put it simplistically, optimistically, that undisciplining is about a sort of progressive change, and I need to be surrounded by people with those kinds of smarts and commitments, because I fall into deep pessimism about whether there is a romanticism once we've sort of enacted the kinds of changes we want to change, we want to institute.
I would just want to jump in response to you, Manu, to say that I think in some ways there's a very simple question that kind of comes to the forefront of what you're saying and what we're all saying here, which is that if we're going to devote ourselves to sustaining the humanities, right, to a future for the humanities and to a future for these fields that we work in, whatever they become, right, as we move them toward that future, the question has to be how are these fields of knowledge good for fighting fascism? How are these fields of knowledge good for ending colonialism, ending imperialism, right? How are these fields of knowledge useful for eliminating anti-Black violence and anti-Black racism, right? And I think that for a long time, our fields in particular, but Anglo literary studies in particular, in general, have held on to this myth that liberalism is like an effective answer to fascism. And I think what we're witnessing right now, and one of the reasons it's so important to go back to Ray's article about this, is that, I just feel like, look around. Liberalism didn't didn't prevent fascism from coming back. It never actually went anywhere, right? But liberalism is extremely compatible with colonialism. That it always has been. Like they're very close siblings, if not like, two faces of the same being.
Yeah.
And so, I think that it's really important for the survival of the humanities that it finally disentangle itself from like the racist myths of liberalism, and the myth that liberalism is actually the answer. Like liberalism is somehow the answer to racism, because it's not. It's feeding its lifeblood. So, I would say that.
Yeah, and I mean, as 18th and 19th centurists, like we are scholars of liberalism. We're also scholars of race, and we kind of have the archive available for the rise of these kinds of political systems, and therefore we should be able to speak to how they can be kind of critiqued and untangled and potentially dismantled. So it's kind of part of our scholarly, it should be part of our scholarly work.
Yeah, in terms of restructuring, in terms of the curriculum and in terms of what we write, I was thinking of Ronjaunee, I was thinking of your book. I got to read the introduction the other day, and it's really, it's a fascinating case of work in Victorian studies that I think most people in Victorian studies would say this is not Victorian studies, because as Ronjaunee says, this is about undoing boundaries and really creating a crisis at the borders and boundaries of the field. And Ronjaunee's writing about, she's writing about pairs of authors, one 19th century writer, one 20 or 21st century writer. And that is just not something that we've called Victorian studies, but of course, there's no reason it shouldn't be. And also there's no reason why a course like that wouldn't be much more politically engaged and engaging for students. One thing students of color say to me all the time is that, something to the effect of, we didn't know English meant England. We didn't know really how much we would be in a white British world studying English. And so restructuring both our writing, the way we think about our fields and we think about writing, seems crucial. And a lot of what U3 and the greater BIPOC movement is doing is to say, sort of what counts as being part of a field, or what is a field. Manu has a devotion to romanticism. I don't have that with Victorian studies. I wouldn't mind if it, it's an absurd, there have been many defenses of the time period of the field as meaning something and being coherent, but I think that's mostly based on an idea of Victorian that we've built up since 1980 or something. I'm just quoting myself in my recent work, but anyway, so I just wanted to hear more about what we can do to really restructure fields. How do we fight fascism, or how do we get students to become politicized through studying literature, which I think I was very politicized for studying literature, and I think things have changed a lot since my graduate school days. So I don't know if anyone wants to take that up specifically in terms of how you're restructuring your writing, your teaching, the syllabus of field courses that you teach. If anybody wants to take that up.
Yeah, I can speak briefly to one thing I do. So my commitment to romanticism is is toward an ethics and a politics that was never realized by the Romantics, or even fully imagined by the Romantics. And so one of the things I do in the classroom is when we read The Mask of Anarchy, that famous Shelleyan, radical tract, I point out that it was actually a politically inert poem. It was censored by Leigh Hunt. It didn't end up coming out until after his death. It was a poem that didn't do anything until in the 20th century it was taken up by figures like Gandhi, who were able to sort of to mobilize that kind of radical potential towards actual political ends, and doing that to sort of to remind us that what we're looking at is not pure or sacred. It's always we're turning to the past for an understanding of a set of strategies and tactics. We've talked a little bit about the difference there. For waging wars against, in that case, tyranny, that can be made to do a kind of work in later, over the course of history through iteration and through reiteration. And so, the political possibilities of re-narrating romanticism seem to me, present to me an opportunity within the class to take actually a fairly canonical romantic piece and sort of expose it, just to put it in a new light and realize new possibilities for it.
Yeah, Gina, do you wanna add?
Yeah, I'll add. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot, and I'm in the process of trying to turn this into, to translate this pedagogically into course design in terms of syllabi and readings, ways of reading, but I haven't quite gotten there yet because I've been blessedly kind of off of teaching for a little while, although blessedly is weird because I have course release for editing, which is fantastic and necessary for editing, but I also have some administrative responsibilities that give me course release, and it turns out I actually really like teaching a lot better than I like sitting in meetings about diversity and inclusion. So it's a mixed blessing. But anyway, the thing that I've been thinking about a lot is it's kind of this is related to the ideas that I was playing with in the essay I published in the Ramblings 18th Century Futures issue a couple months ago. It's about the literal grounding of 18th century studies as they are practiced in colonized territories like all of North America. A few weeks ago, I had the pleasure and the privilege of listening to one of the University of Maryland's anti-racist series with Nikki Hessel and Robbie Richardson and Megan Pizer. It was a really, really fantastic conversation about the relationship between 18th century studies and Indigenous studies, but also Indigenous knowledge ways and life ways. And one of the things that Nikki said that really stuck with me because it was about where I am right now, she said, right now, Haudenosaunee land defenders from Six Nations are being arrested, are standing in protection of their territory and being arrested by the RCMP in the name of an 18th century treaty, right? They're insisting that an 18th century treaty be honored by the provincial and the federal government. And she said something like, this is an 18th century problem. It's happening right now. And so I think that that's one example of how we can begin to approach all of our engagement with anything we would call 18th century materials, right? By thinking, it's kind of a practice. It's just a practice, but to try to think about yourself as someone engaging the 18th century in whatever manifestation in the time and place and embodiment and circuits of knowledge that are in you, right? Who are you? What are you? Where are you knowing from? And where are you? Where are you right now? Where is this thought happening? And in North America, I can't imagine how this exercise cannot be an exercise in realizing that the thing we call the 18th century is here with us now. That there's no division between past and present, that they are intertwined problems, and that has to inform the ethics and the responsibilities that we take on in our reading of any materials, any literatures of that time, right? So, how to do that then is a whole other conversation, but that's just like one idea for a starting point.
Yeah, I mean, I love that piece. Oh, sorry, Elaine.
No, go ahead, go.
I just wanted to say that I love that piece. Eugenia, the kind of metaphor of the ship as the institution is a really sort of powerful one. And the invitation to think about land and place, also one that we, tend to gloss over or don't maybe act on in the classroom. And also I'm always inspired by Manu's commitment to this kind of like insurgent romanticism that I think can be sort of powerfully taught in the classroom, as a kind of different genealogy than the one given in the kind of conventional canon. And I would just say on the teaching question that, like, one of the things that I always think about that, took me a long time to find a language for is what kinds of, affective investments do I have in the texts that I study? These kinds of literary objects from the 19th century, and how to make space for those kinds of feelings in the classroom, because I didn't come to Victorian studies out of deep and abiding love, like fandom, identification, nostalgia, comfort, trust, safety, cheer, all of those kinds of more kind of positive investments in these texts that, kind of pass for the norm. But rather, what could a kind of critical engagement with these literary texts mean in the classroom and in our scholarship that are modeled on more, on uglier feelings or just kind of more ambivalent ones, right? That can be a model for teaching, for engagement, and for criticism too.
Yeah, something I'm fond of pointing out to my students is that "fuck you" is a form of engagement, right? To sort of take up, the egregious racism of a 19th century text, and to be disgusted with it, and to say "fuck you" to the text is a form of engagement. It's a legitimate form of engagement. And because I try and fail to be the hip professor, I use a metaphor from, it's not a metaphor, an example from Jay-Z's The Takeover, which is one of his diss tracks against Nas, and the whole song is going at Nas, going at Nas, going at Nas, and then in the very end, he says, and basically for the rest of you all, haters, fuck you, you only get half a bar. And that really is like, that's the thing, right? If you're actually deeply engaging with something and working through those ugly feelings, you create an entire track, right? You can create an entire sort of aesthetic moment and encounter. And that's actually valuable in ways that cancellation or sort of throwing off to the side, giving half a bar to, aren't, right? And so that for me is the role of Wordsworth in a romanticism seminar, for example, right? He's the one we say "fuck you" to and explore that.
You should teach a seminar that's just called "Fuck Wordsworth."
Fuck Wordsworth.
Dose of poetry. It's okay. I kind of wanted to just riff off of what you're thinking through right here, Manu, for a second, as part of this, because it goes back to the idea of the two-row wampum, which is one of the it's a treaty agreement made by Haudenosaunee and originally Dutch kind of explorers who arrived here, but eventually it was taken up by the British. And so, British and Haudenosaunee leaders kind of, over time, multiple times, kind of, like revisited and remade this particular wampum belt. And that's where the image of the ship in the canoe comes from, right? So the agreement is that the wampum itself has these two lanes of purple beads. Is it purple? Yeah, purple beads surrounded by white, and one represents the ship, which is Haudenosaunee kind of culture and governance systems, and one is the canoe, and then the other is the ship, which are the Europeans. And the idea is that they will proceed, alongside one another in peace without interfering with one another's governance or lifeways. And clearly that's not how things have played out in these lands. But I've been thinking, so we have I'm very excited because in the next issue of ECF is our fall issue. Manu has a flash essay in there, which I'm really excited to see in print, about metonymy as like the distinction between metonymy and metaphor in terms of how we think about decolonization, right? So having taken the lesson, the really crucial lesson from Eve Tuck and Kei Wei Yang's piece, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, and understanding, the political stakes or the political work of metaphor, right, in perpetuating colonizing structures. Manu has this wonderful, devastatingly short little piece that's just what about metonymy, right? Which opens up so many possibilities, I think. And a colleague of mine, a colleague and friend, Caitlin Debicki, who's Haudenosaunee Mohawk, we were working on a piece together, and I had her read your piece, Manu, and she wanted to write she wanted to take it up. It's not exactly a response. It's more like she takes up the idea of metonymy and develops it into this essay that's really thinking about the history of two-row diplomacy and how the failure of Europeans to abide by the terms that were very clearly established in these diplomatic interactions in the 18th century is a result of them not grasping the literalness of metonymic thinking, right? The way that metonymic chains of signification carry real, actual, literal, land, beings, obligations, kinships. They carry them in them. They don't move away from them. They carry them forward, and they carry them into other figures. So that's coming out in the winter issue, along with an amazing essay by Sal Nicolazzo, who I believe is in the audience here, that kind of addresses some of the things that we were talking about earlier in this conversation about the failures of, in the case of 18th century studies, why the global turn, or the new 18th centuries of a couple decades ago, why that didn't actually perform the structural change, and specifically the overhauling of white supremacy, right, in the field. How is it possible to become suddenly alert to and take up colonialism, racism, right, in a way that actually continues to reproduce it structurally? So, all these, we've got this really exciting conversation happening. And what I'll shut up in a second, but what I really wanted to say is that I've been thinking a lot. I'm thinking about both of your comments about confrontation, right? Confrontation as a necessary mode of doing some of this work. And I just wanted to add to it that I've been thinking a lot about, I hate confrontation. I'm really opposed to it. it. It just makes it, there are all kinds of reasons, but I like it. So I avoid it. And instead, I have tried to find ways of like thinking non-confrontationally with people in ways that make me feel like healthy and intellectually and personally nourished, and not, like dirty and complicit or just bad.
Mm-hmm.
And I had this thought this morning about how when we really seriously cultivate the skills of thinking with and alongside rather than over or in place of, right? Which is one of the concepts carried in two-row, the idea of two-row relations, but also, there are all of these other contexts. But it's not the norm in academia, right? We all know academia is it's viciously hierarchical. It's all about argument, intervention, right? The most you can hope for is like negotiation, where we're going to reconcile, like our positions to one another. But if we learn to think alongside, then the term against becomes a different kind of relationship. When you say you're against something, in the economy of competition, against means opposed to, against means, like antagonistic to, or trying to overcome, or violent to. But in an economy of like alongsideness, against can mean like abutting. It can mean leaning into one another in a way that allows us to support one another in our kind of like separate and without reconciliation, right? Like in our difference, we can lean into one another and be a source of support. And that can just be how it is. It's not how it is right now, but I want to figure out how to do that. And I think these are grammatical issues. This is what we teach, right? We have the expertise to try to understand how to bring these kinds of linguistic figurations into material being.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I just want to thank Ryan Fong for being an amazing ally throughout this conversation by posting articles, also the information for how to donate to the Haudenosaunee people to their efforts right now. So thank you, Ryan. I don't see you, but I feel your presence. Ryan is also part of a group. I don't know if we've mentioned this, of Undisciplining the Victorian Classroom. He's three other scholars starting a database of syllabi that undiscipline the Victorian Studies classroom, which I think is really exciting. So I just wanted to thank him. I didn't want to call on him, I don't know, but thank him very much. It's kind of an example of what Gina's talking about, I think. Is this kind of participation that Ryan's doing right now. I think we should probably ask for questions, and we're going to do it the old-fashioned Zoom way of raising your hand, not literally, I guess it's not literal, raising your hand, I'm not even sure. And then I will call on people sort of randomly, I guess.
Hi, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks for that really wonderful, stimulating discussion. I have a question that is about administration and academia. And if anyone is tweeting, I'm going to ask you not to tweet this out because of the particularities. So I'm in a private university in Oklahoma, so native country, mostly Muskogee Creek land. And I became a department chair in January. And so, I feel deeply invested in this conversation as a scholar, but I'm also now constantly running on this second track of a low-level administrator, department chair, trying to think about how to protect my department. And for example, thinking about undisciplining, I get and value and am invested in that concept, but I'm also at a university where administration has been trying to push all the humanities into a, so for them, undisciplining sounds like something very different, which is basically withdrawing resources. And I guess I was just wondering if any of you had thoughts about what anti-racist administration looks like, and B, how to intertwine this advocacy for the humanities with anti-racism.
Who wants to take that up? Gina, do you have who has the most administrative experience? I think maybe
I've never been a department chair, but I've sat on a zillion committees. I mean, the short answer to the first part of your question is that no, I don't have. I can't say that I've ever kind of witnessed a good example of what I would call anti-racist administration. I've witnessed, people at the department level really put everything in them into trying to protect the department and their faculty and their faculty of color, of whom in my department there are not very many. I think that in my experience, these have all been white chairs, who kind of took responsibility for, insulating the people in the department, under their purview from some of the more pernicious or ever-present, pressures of the economy of racism in the institution and in the world. But that's honorable. That's really hard work. And I'm really grateful for it, but I'm not sure that rises to the level of anti-racist administration, right? It's like, resisting the effects of racism as they circulate in the institution and actually changing the structure of the institution to try to disrupt those flows are different things. And I think that maybe one of the reasons I haven't seen a good example is because in my institution, faculty have been saying, and students have been saying for years, that the discrepancy between the diversity of the student body and of the faculty, but especially the upper administrative body at my institution, it's glaring, right? And I do think, it's not that hiring, like Manu said earlier, you can put a person of color in a position of authority and there's absolutely no guarantee that they're going to do anti-racist work, right? And in fact, the way that institutions are structured, it's very, very unlikely that the people who actually get put in those positions are either inclined or given the means to do anti-racist work, right? So you see, at least up here in Canada, every year a story of the first Indigenous dean of such and such school quit, after 1 or 2 years because they couldn't do the work that they thought that they were being hired to do. So I'm not sure that the conditions exist yet for anti-racist administrative work. I don't have a good answer for what we should do to change that. It's so big.
I can very quickly, I don't want to take up too much time because I know there's so many people asking questions, but as an example of what I've seen go well at Rutgers-Newark, which is consistently ranked one of the most diverse campuses in the United States, has most recently been in their formation of an honors living and learning community. And so you can Google Rutgers-Newark HLLC. But the principle behind it was that they were beginning from the starting point. They were beginning from the point where they acknowledged that the traditional honors programs begin with a metric that's already weighted against particularly Black Newark residents. And so they wanted to define honors and merit and academic merit, not based on on test scores, but also not grade. It's a grades blind program, so they don't look at your transcripts. It's they do. There's essays and there's interviews, and the very coveted positions for students within the HLLC. They ended up going to people who didn't necessarily have the test scores or the grades, but who showed a particular kind of promise that became visible once we redefined the very terms of honor and merit and gifted and talented and all those things. So I'm not going to go into it any further because there's a lot to talk about, but you can email me or Google the HLLC to find out how they went about that.
Someone through the chat asked to be called on. I think the person's last name is Kim, Jong Kyung Kim. I don't know how to unmute you. I don't know how to find you.
Yeah, here I am.
Hi.
Okay, first I want to say thank you all of the panels and then people who organized this great talk. It is really thoughtful and very thought-provoking. So I guess I have two questions. So if you guys feel these are hard to answer, both of them, I totally understand. So first of all, I want to say about very briefly about my background. I'm an international student and PhD student studying 19th century British literature in Texas. Then I'm from South Korea, and then I was born and grown up in East Asian country. So that's my background. So my question, the first question is about the relationship between two terms, BIPOC and then ethnicity. So I'm struggling with how I can understand the intersection between BIPOC and then ethnicity, because sometimes when we think about all the social issues through the lens of race, I also at the same time see some void among the discourses, because when we see through this situation from the perspective of ethnic studies, we also need to confront or encounter sometimes ethnicities, all the problems happening among different ethnic groups cannot be understood or solved by the exact same approach we take to the issues of BIPOC. So that's my first question. The second question is this: how do we understand or how do we deal with people of color who have internalized white supremacy? So, for example, when I was watching Republican convention or Trump's rally, I was shocked to see people of color who publicly claimed they are standing with him and then his political vision. So these are two my questions.
Those are small. I think we can dispose of those in a couple of minutes. Who wants to take a stab? Gina?
I want to hear Manu's answer to the question about ethnic studies, honestly.
I was going to weigh in on the other one. And
okay. Well, I want to hear your answer to that one too.
But I wasn't going to weigh in very coherently, probably, except to go back to something that I mentioned earlier, which is that there is a position, that there's a particular ethical political crisis for people of color in the United States, where you have basically a choice to emphasize your proximity to whiteness or to emphasize your alienation from it. And it's ethical and political because it opens up a set of responsibilities, right? And if you go one way, you're at best, right? So I'm not thinking about necessarily a Trump supporter, but a well-meaning brown liberal. You're at best committing to the idea that a liberal democracy founded on slavery and colonialism can in fact overcome that historical past through expansion and through reconciliation and through all those kinds of terms, right? That I see as a kind of liberal stance that that acknowledges, or that sort of blinds. I don't want to put a value judgment on it. I'm trying to be very even about it, but that doesn't prioritize one's responsibility to other alienated communities whose alienation differs not in degree from the position of the brown person vis-a-vis the white, or the brown community vis-a-vis the white, but differs in kind, right? So that's what we're talking about when we talk about the relationship between brown, right, which actually encompasses a variety of ethnicities that are complicated and I can't sort of fully go into here, except to say that I have a fuller response to the relationship between brown as a racial category and the issues of ethnicity that it actually occludes, but doesn't have to. So it opens up a particular ethical and political crisis. And that's just among the sort of the ones that we give the most leeway to. Then there's the group you're talking about, right? Then there's Dinesh D'Souza, then there's Nikki Haley, then there's a whole other category that has thrown their weight fully behind a kind of a politics of exclusion that they've managed to sort of to fool themselves into believing doesn't exclude them. How do you reckon with those people? I think one of my touchstone works, the most influential works to me, which I talked about in various times, is Vijay Prashad's Karma of Brown Folk, which is a book that's written really directly against Dinesh D'Souza. And for me, it was important because it was the first time I realized you could be brown and like radically committed to anti-blackness, right, to fighting anti-blackness. And so those kinds of conversations are happening, or have happened. That book came out 20 years ago, but I think it's a long road towards a sort of more broadly ethical commitment to anti-racism from other people of color. That wasn't brief at all. I apologize.
I do have a thought about the second question, but I feel like I've taken a lot of airtime, and so I want to invite Ronjaunee to talk if you have anything to say before I take more.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could all talk at length and make various diss tracks about, the model minority support of the right, of Trump, of the liberal fantasy. But I would also echo Manu's point that there's so much good work coming out now that really kind of takes up this problem. It's not a benign one, but is like a deeply violent and kind of urgent question. So I mean, I really like Kathy Park Hong's Minor Feelings, or anything that just kind of deconstructs how buying into that kind of seeming fantasy, that reward system, right, that you noted kind of like works at the institutional level, also works at the state level, and that the two things are not separate. And maybe kind of on that question too, like, my understanding of critical ethnic studies is also that, it really kind of takes up questions of the state, of biopolitics, and it's kind of invites us to think about how race is, positioned vis-a-vis those structures. And so I'm thinking about someone like Jasbir Puar, who is really kind of, excellent about this.
Can I just jump in, because this question makes me want to go back to something Manu said earlier about, the fuck you to, let's say the racist Victorian text that I teach. And I mean, I did teach Victorian texts as largely a group of racist tracks in various ways, and misogynistic and anti-Semitic and all kinds of, I wasn't a fan either of the Victorian novel or the Victorian, or the sort of culture of the Victorian period, the philosophy, the emergence of liberalism. But I think that one of the problems is if we teach these white writers, even if we're calling them out all the time, if I only teach white writers, and I have largely in 25 years taught white writers, the message is still that, you know, these are the people who are worth reading. And if you internalize that, obviously you internalize all kinds of racism and homophobia, et cetera. And like, if you get hated enough, you hate yourself. And I think part of my feeling about restructuring, at least the curriculum in my period, is that to continuously talk about racism of white writers is just not enough. I mean, that's what I've been doing. And I mean, I think I learned that from teaching in prison, where students said, you know, because there were many, many courses offered on slavery, for example. And students actually became quite incensed and said, you know, we don't want to keep hearing about slavery. We're slaves now. You know, we want to hear about, you know, a past, an African past, you know. So we sort of created on the spot a unit on African studies, for example. But it really taught me a very profound lesson, that to talk to these guys and tell them about, you know, slavery and racism, like they know that. I mean, they know that already. You know, I mean, that it can induce a kind of abjection. That was my experience, and then that really brought home to me what I had been doing in, you know, the previous years of my career before my students in prison really sort of, as we used to say, pulled my coat, you know, really sort of woke me up to what I was doing and what other people were doing there in talking about slavery, which I think people, again, I mean, to Gina's point, I think it's a liberal strategy. Like, we understand how much you've been hated on, you know, like, enough already, you know, let's do something, to do something different seemed to me to be urgent. So anyway, but thank you for your very big but really important questions.
I just, in response real quickly, I'm never real quick, to your observations about, you know, syllabi, you know, revising our syllabi. This is a question that came up in another conversation, or maybe several other conversations I've had about anti-racist pedagogy recently in 18th century studies, literary studies in particular. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is the way that in some of my 18th century courses, rather than make a big effort to, you know, incorporate a bunch of new, you know, non-white voices as primary texts, which, I mean, there's not a lot to draw on in 18th century British lit, you know, I mean, there's not nothing, but, you know, that's a different kind of project. I actually think that, for now at least, it has proven really pedagogically worthwhile to simply overhaul the critical apparatus of the course. You know, teach all the same primary texts, maybe like add a few more that, you know, kind of correspond to what the new, you know, secondary work is you know, focusing on. But to teach a course of primarily white British writers from the 18th century and have your entire critical apparatus, all the secondary readings, be scholars of color or people working in anti-colonial or ethnic studies, completely changes, you know, what you're doing, what your reading is doing in that course. And it also, I mean, it changes what you're doing with the primary texts, but it also has the effect of centering BIPOC expertise, which I actually think is one of the most crucial things we need to be doing in all of our classes right now, regardless of the content. And that for students, like, I think that whereas, you know, like thematizing racist violence, which, you know, because it's a problem, right? So like, we want to address it. We want to talk about it. We want to excavate it, right? But thematizing it and centering it in our teaching is like, BIPOC students in particular experience that as violence, right? It just like, you know, it's just a rehearsal of forms of harm that they don't have to learn. They've learned them. They've learned them too much. So I find that that's a kind of, often well-intentioned pedagogical move that really aggressively recenters white learning at the expense of the well-being of non-white students in the room. And, but centering BIPOC expertise and ways of knowing is actually, that has a much greater potential of providing opportunities for like joy and fulfillment, and positive engagement, finding scholarly role models, right, that students might not have known were out there, and realizing that someone who's working on, for example, Black diasporic studies, who doesn't really talk about 18th century British literature at all, can be an expert on the literature that we're reading in the room, right? That expertise carries to everything.
Oh, that's great. I actually, that what you're saying makes me think of something that Ronjaunee was saying the other day that I wonder if maybe now is a good time to sort of reflect on it, because what I'm thinking is, you can't center anti-racist scholars, Black scholars, Indigenous scholars, if you only have if you're not fully committed to working with their texts and digging in and sort of understanding the sort of critical tradition that they're working from. So, or we risk the sort of additive quality that we were talking about before, right? So it requires a deep engagement. And one of the things that, Ronjaunee, you were pointing out the other day that gave me a lot of hope was the idea that actually we see, especially among early career scholars, trained in, who in 19th century studies, 18th century studies, reading groups forming, a genuine commitment to not just, checking, Saidiya Hartman off of a bibliography, but to in fact really working with a range of important scholars that they can then sort of bring into their pedagogical practice and in their criticism.
Yeah, I mean, there's, in Victorian studies, the Race and Trans-Imperial group, which is organized by some wonderful grad students. And, I wish I had those texts and kinds of communities, available when I was a younger grad student. I wish I had Lisa Lowe's book. I wish I had, read a lot of Black feminist theory along with the literature that I was studying. But, it is a kind of, it's not a bibliographical kind of cumulative impulse. It's a really kind of hopeful way of changing our citational politics, which is, I think, kind of one of the things that we can do, as Eugenia pointed out, as scholars who are working in these kinds of often primarily white sets of texts, and how to kind of just move them out of the center, how to not do what Elaine mentioned, which is sort of like feed into students' potential abjection. It's to, as you said, elevate the expertise of scholars of color, and to kind of do the deep work of reading and thinking with them. I mean, you really can't go back from that. So
that's great. It's true. Yeah. If you really change your secondary, your sort of your critics, the people that you cite. Yeah. That is huge. And doing that at the syllabic. Is that a word? Does that mean syllabus or syllables? I don't know. But anyway, doing that on the syllabus is in the classroom is tremendous. Are there other questions?
There was one from Lillian in the chat.
Lillian?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi. I really appreciate all the panelists today, and I've long admired all of your work, so thank you so much for speaking today. I'm coming at this question from a graduate student perspective. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate at UCLA, a British Romanticist, and I don't always get to build my own syllabus when I'm TAing, of course. So I'm kind of wondering, during my undergraduate experience, I had mentors who really allowed me to create my own archive and to, read a lot of queer literature, read things that weren't the canon. But then when I applied to graduate school, I felt like I was at such a big disadvantage because I didn't know the canon. I didn't read from the Bible to Chaucer to Shakespeare onward. And I had to do a lot of that learning on my own. And then when I came to grad school, I also felt like such a fish out of water because of that. And I think about this all the time as a graduate student and now as a teacher. How do I square these two things? Because, I love critiquing the canon. I love reading outside of it. I love teaching outside of it. But I often think about my students of color who might be interested in the future in joining the academy, in applying to graduate school, with a lot of disclaimers and caveats attached to that. And I don't know how to reconcile these two things because I do feel the pressure to teach the canon so that I can, help my students feel like they're equipped with it if they need it. Yes. So sorry, that was a little bit of a ramble, but thank you so much.
That's a really great point.
It is a great question. And I'm not going to dwell on it because I've also taken up a lot of airtime, but I will sort of just try and fold this into Ian Balfour had a question in the chat about the difference between the kind of structural change we're talking about when we're teaching undergraduates and we're teaching graduate students. And I wonder if this is a site where, in fact, there are different sort of urgencies about what we teach and how.
Yeah, I just want to jump in because when I got to grad school, I didn't know anything at all. I went to night school for like 8 years to get my undergraduate degree, and I just took what was at 5:15 and 6:30 or whatever, so it wasn't a well-rounded education. And I feel that I had this exact same feeling that I have to give my students the cultural capital that is the canon. And that's a lot of why we need to bust it, because that's the argument of John Guillory's cultural capital, right? Is that you don't do African American studies. You give students the great writing of the past, or something. I'm sorry, that's a deformation. And now I'm going to get into trouble on Twitter, as I did for somebody who said I was most famous for dragging Jameson on Twitter. I hope that's not my greatest moment of fame. But anyway, I think that's why we have to remember we're a discipline that's like 150 years old, right? We're we're colonizing, not only a colonial discipline, a discipline that was used to colonize South Asian people. The idea if you read British literature, you'd become a brown Briton because you would just be so blown away by it. So sorry, I'm not a panelist, but I just had to. I love the question. I've had all those kinds of conflicts and also feeling like a fish out of water. And I think that's why we have to really, this canon, it's a very recent, it's not a hallowed thing, it's a very recent invention and we can reinvent it, and I don't think everybody has to read the same text. I don't know. There's always that thing that I do that you can't have a conversation if we don't, but I can talk to Manu. I don't know. He talks a lot about like Kant. I get very intimidated, it's really like, what? I don't know, whatever.
I'm opening the canon to include Kant. That's my big, that's the big contribution.
Right. But I talk to people all the time where I don't know the text that they've read. It's exciting. It's not a problem. It's exciting. It's a provocation. It's like either I'm gonna read some of what they read, or I'm gonna read over here. Anyway, so I love your question. I don't know if the panel. Let me shut up. Sorry.
No, I love it too. I want to jump right off of like what you were just saying. But before I do that, I want to also plug that Lillian has an article, a wonderful article coming out in the fall ECF along with Manu's flash essay. And actually there's an article by Nikki Hessel in that issue as well. So stay tuned
cool
for Lillian's work, which is, I think it's supposed to come out on Project Muse like any day now. No, I love this question. And I just like kind of, feeding off of what Manu and Elaine, you both just said, but especially you, Elaine. I think, you know, at the risk of, I don't want to suggest that like anyone is particularly enjoying living in like the moment that we're in right now, culturally and politically and climatically, and you know, so so things are very bad, like they're very bad. But one of the aspects of realizing that you are living through the collapse of an imperial regime that you kind of grew up taking for granted and not recognizing as such until it really started to crumble, is that the cultural capital of the English literary canon is more meaningless than ever right now. You know, so I mean, Lily, and I'm taking your question really seriously because I think it is a serious question, and it's a question about ethical pedagogy, you know, and like what it is you are responsible for giving to your students. And it's important to think really seriously about what you are equipping them with, right? But I think that the structure of the imperial or the colonial, you know, academy has always been equip them, you know, in these literature departments, right? And this system, as Elaine said, is not very old, but like equip them with the cultural capital of this particular kind of knowledge. And that is going to carry them into some kind of social and professional success, right? Then they too can become, you know, professors of English literature. You know, like that's not, that it doesn't, that is not actually very useful to them anymore. And that's, I think, an opportunity. That's a really important opportunity that we need to seize on, and we need to think collectively about really seriously, for us to think about what else we might be equipping our students with in our classrooms, and how that is going to ready them and prepare them to participate in the world we're actually living in, right? Or the worlds that might come out of what we're living through right now. How are we going to prepare students not just to survive, right, going forward, but to help make the future better than our shared present, right? How do we prepare them to do that? And, you know, I don't know, maybe reading Wordsworth, maybe Wordsworth has a role in all of this, right? But it's no longer just that, you know, like that intellectual property is going to translate into some kind of prosperity for almost anyone. And that is an opportunity for kind of radical intervention at the pedagogical level, like Elaine is saying, of redefining the you know, the kind of the usefulness of the knowledge that we help to cultivate in our classrooms for being in the world.
I think Carrie Sinanan has a question.
Hello. Don't hear.
Hi.
It's really late. Hi. On a Friday afternoon. Thanks so much and for all the questions and the discussion. So I think I want to ask a question about extinction, because that was the word that Manu brought us to the slough of despair in some of his comments. You know, making us really reckon with what you've also just been talking about, Gina, which is the tenuousness of the precarity, not just of people who are precarious in the institution, but of the entire institution. And, you know, it is a fact that humanities subjects are being wiped out right now in the UK. And my former university closed down languages, they threatened to close down philosophy, they just won. You know, English departments are going to start shutting down. And I was thinking, you know, you're all talking about an era of postgraduate study that I come from too, and Stuart Hall was my kind of touchstone. And he said in his cultural diversity essay, it is not worth keeping an institution alive for 1 minute after it ceases to be a space for open possibilities. And I mean, I think this is what we have to reckon with. Academia is hierarchical. Somebody called it a pyramid scheme on Twitter today. And so my real question is, the kind of kinships that we're talking about here, and the kind of kinships that we are complicit with creating in the academy, are completely incompatible. And here, we're scurrying to do various things to get tenure, to get published. So my question is really, we're all facing mass extinction. Liberal tenured professors and adjunct lecturers alike, if we don't do something differently. Manu, you said that we are not far from a place. There's a reason why they're attacking the humanities, because possibly that's our hope. This is where critical thinking might lie. But unless I'm thinking here of whiteness as positionality, unless in our white positionality, and unless in our whiteness in the academy we do something together, rather than against each other, none of us are really going to survive. So my real question is, what do we do in our whiteness within the academy? I mean, do we get rid of tenure? What do we actually have to do to stop making ourselves be an imperial structure and move more towards what the three of you think? Ronjaunee, you talked about what's valued and what's not valued. How do we change that? How do we change what's valued?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bleak set of thoughts, right? Like, just, restructuring, undisciplining, the way these incredibly necessary and urgent ideas can quickly get co-opted, by an overall movement to just kind of like end critical thinking, the humanities, intellectual sort of communities writ large is, I think, clear to everyone. I mean, to me, solidarity across rank is crucial. I don't, that's very difficult to enact at institutions, but that seems to be incredibly important. And also, I mean, we have been talking in the past few questions about cultural capital, but I mean, your question kind of puts it in relief. I mean, what cultural capital do students really acquire by reading, Trollope? Like, in the world, like, virtually none, right? So we have an exaggerated sense of what that means, but perhaps it is best to kind of, fight for a kind of place for critical thinking, for the humanities, while divesting very much from these standards built by white supremacy for what's good and what's not, what's valued and what's not, what's rigorous and what's not, right? And I'm sure other people have better ways to, or more concrete ways to explain how that might happen. But that's kind of my more general thought.
To get on my soapbox briefly, because it's an answer to this, and a few people asked for the soapbox. You're not getting the full soapbox experience, but I will say there's a panel at MLA sponsored by the CELJ, the Council of Editors of Learned Journals, about BIPOC editors in literary fields. So if you're attending virtual MLA, this question will be addressed in much length there. But I would say one kind of pragmatic way that we can begin to make some of those cultural changes and revaluations in academic disciplines is by changing the leadership of editorial boards, editors of books, books at university presses, editors of journals. Because one of the things that I've learned being the editor of a journal, a widely read journal in my field, and a highly respected journal in my field, highly respected before I came on, is that you get to remake a lot of rules. Like, you get to be in charge. That's something I had to learn gradually. This is true of my entire job. But I'd say that as an assistant professor, I was working under this constant anxiety that I think is nearly universal among junior professors, that I was doing everything wrong and trying really hard to do my job in the model of the people who came before me, when I had actually been hired. A non-cynical take of why I was hired was because my peers expected that I would do things my way, right? But so you spend several years kind of suffering through trying to be a certain kind of scholar that you are not, And then for me, there was, and I mean, this is structural. It's like, this is a benefit of tenure, right? I have the job security to have this kind of shift in my own scholarly practice. Not everybody has that. But for me, post tenure, it was like, it's dawned on me, like, I'm literally in charge of this journal. Like, I get to decide, what counts as rigorous scholarship, what counts as scholarship on the 18th century, what counts as a robust citation practice on an article about time period. And that's a position from which you can very pragmatically make meaningful shifts in the constitution of the field and the way that it is practiced, right? The way that knowledge is generated and the way that people practice. Manu and I are co-editing a special issue of ECF, and we decided right off the bat that we wanted to include a range of different lengths of essays, not just standard research articles, but also, flash essays, different forms to be kind of more inclusive of different formats of critical thought. And we're also we're encouraging people to submit co-authored or multi-authored essays in an attempt to, encourage more collaborative writing practice in literary studies, where it is still not at all the norm. And being able to do that with a journal like ECF I think it's meaningful. And I want to see a whole lot more of that happening in our.
And I'll say, it's coupled with the idea of having scholars of color in editorial positions, when I admire white editors who are willing to go to bat for their darker cousins. What Rebecca Colesworthy in particular has done at SUNY has been so important for getting Bigger Six off the ground, giving a platform and freedom to a range of scholars who are working against certain tides in Romanticism. And you see this elsewhere too. Jerry Singerman was really welcoming of a new Race Before Race series at UPenn, which is run by Ayanna Thompson and Geraldine Heng. So there's, right, you see this kind of thing happening when people are willing to, and it kind of goes back to that citation practice thing, right? To commit to the expertise of scholars of color, and to start with the assumption that we know what the fuck we're doing, and that there's a space for us in these conversations that is not only sort of useful to us, but to furthering sort of academic inquiry within our chosen fields. Which is also, I think, this is a good moment where we can, I know we have a question from Smaran, but can we applaud Ronjaunee? You're going to be editing the Norton Critical Middlemarch, right?
Yes.
And I've poked fun at Norton publicly sort of a lot, but you see, right, that at that moment where we're willing to begin by acknowledging the expertise, your expertise in this case, over George Eliot, a George Eliot novel, right? I think that's an important sort of that is an important. It's a transformative move, not just lip service.
Yeah, it really is. Okay, Smaran, do you have a question? I think I see you in the chat.
Yeah, super quickly, just about since this panel is organized around the 18th and 19th century, I was wondering if you could say something about the problems of periodization and how that intersects with anti-racism and organizing the canon or organizing literary history, but also the limits of language doing this work within English departments. So when you're studying the 18th century, are we studying Ojibwe text? Are we studying Cherokee text? What is the actual work that we're doing? I really appreciate what you said, Eugenia, about the critical apparatus and like scholars of color and that entire discussion. My minor experience taking grad classes in 18th and 19th century studies has been that there are a lot of these texts out there, but they're often not studied. And so how do we bring sort of linguistic proficiencies? How do we acquire them, establish them within the university that's hopefully also disappearing? Just periodization and language.
Yeah, that's a great question. I really am going to try to give a short response. I think I have one in my hand to what is a big question. So in my department, I'm teaching one of our new first year courses next term. I've been teaching our introductory level English courses for a long time, but we recently kind of overhauled the first year curriculum. And so I'm teaching this course that's called Making and Remaking Literary Traditions for the very first time. And I still have to write the syllabus for it. But one thing that we've discussed in my department, so we have, McMaster has a relationship, has an Indigenous Studies, a robust Indigenous Studies program, and has a kind of like formal or a few sets of formal relationships with Six Nations Polytechnic. And my colleague, Daniel Coleman, gave a talk in our department last term, before pandemic times, about reading wampum, about, wampum studies as a kind of like an essential literacy skill for literature students studying in this place, right? So part of my introductory level course, there is going to be a guest lecture from my colleague Caitlin Debicki on reading wampum, and I think that is, there's so much work to do. You can't do a survey that includes everything that should be read. But I think that this is actually something that we can and should be doing.
That's great. One thing about periodization that I think about in terms of British studies is that in English departments, there's this idea that in big departments at R1 places or even smaller departments, that there has to be representation of every single period. And in a large department, you need 3 or 4 people in every period of British studies, means that there are no lines left for even African American studies, let alone Indigenous studies, let alone all the other people, that we could be hiring if we, let these. I think there's less. This is a controversial thing probably with the panels. I don't know, but I think there's less difference between periods of British literature than we make a big fuss about, difference between 19th century novels or 18th century novels. I think we're making a bigger fuss than we actually need to. I think we could have fewer people in British studies, which would allow us to hire, people who teach Anglophone literature much more broadly, which at least in my institution, which, everyone knows what it is, but we don't do. Which is not unusual. I think most places don't do it. They do the 4 Victorianists, 4 Romanticists, that kind of thing. So I think that's a problem with periodization and race and the kinds of things we're talking about. I just wanted to throw that in there. I think we're way over time, and maybe people have other commitments. I can't imagine what they might be, but I really enjoyed this. I want to thank Manu, Gina, and Ronjaunee so much, not only for this panel, but for the way they've changed the way that I think, along with a lot of other BIPOC scholars. And thank the organizers again. And I don't know if you guys want to sign off with anything.
I just want to say thank you to you, Elaine, to all the organizers for setting this up so conscientiously, and my fellow panelists who are brilliant, and it's an honor to share space with you, and to everybody who showed up to listen with us and talk with us.
Yeah, Corey Reisinger and Isaac Robertson, the 2 grad students who did a ton of work